Morning. Let's start with a simple question. What is a principle? Principle is a universally understood truth. And a secure design principle is one upon which an organization builds systems that are resilient against attack. Now, here we are at a conference focused on enterprise data. So it's important to consider the distinction between data and assets. What I'm going to do today is walk you through a case study of where a collection of organizations didn't appropriately consider that distinction. And we're going to talk about how that introduced some security problems. But then ultimately we're going to talk about how organizations can think about addressing those particular problems. What I'll be doing is presenting some security research that my organization recently published. I'll walk you through what we did, what we found, and ultimately what we recommend, all of which boils down to principles of secure design. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, my name is Ted Harrington. I'm one of the owners of Independent Security Evaluators. We perform manual white box security assessments for organizations who want to understand how they'll get attacked and how to defend accordingly. As we perform both security consulting as well as security research, some of which I'll talk about today, some of you may be familiar with some of our more landmark pieces of security research. We were the first company to hack the iPhone when that first came out. We then went on to be the first company to hack the Android operating systems. We pioneered car hacking when in 2005 we hacked a Ford Taurus. And we provided some valuable contributions to the area of election tampering when we found exploitable security vulnerabilities in Diebold's electronic voting machines. The reason I mention all of that is to help give you a sense of the lens through which we see the world. So whether we're performing our security assessments in our consulting practice or we're performing security research, we're always looking at systems from the perspective of the malicious adversary. Who are the bad guys? How do they attack systems? Why do they attack systems? Because when an organization can understand those things, an organization can then be best suited in order to defend accordingly. And you'll see that's woven through a lot of the things that we'll talk about today. So my hope is that you can walk away from today's session and go back with something meaningful to your organizations to think about what data means in the context of security for your organization. So the case study that I'm going to be presenting is focused in healthcare. Many of the principles that we're going to talk about today, though, are not specific to healthcare. So I'm using this case study as an example to ground in a concrete way some of the more abstract concepts that we'll talk about. But as we go through this, make sure you're thinking about this through the lens of what does this mean to me and my organization, even if your organization is not in healthcare. Is anybody familiar with this study that we just published about 6 weeks ago called Hacking Hospitals? No? It made some pretty big news. We spent 24 months looking at 12 hospitals, a couple of healthcare data facilities, a couple of medical devices, and a host of supporting applications and other technologies. And what we were trying to do was to investigate this. Can someone deploy a cyber attack that results in patient harm or fatality? We distributed the research geographically across the country, because even though it would be more convenient for us to just look at hospitals in the Baltimore area, which is where we're headquartered, we did not want the outcome of this to in any way be perceived as a regional problem. Very much what we were studying was at least a national problem, possibly a global problem, though the scope of the research was limited to the United States. And it all boiled down to this question. If you can rewind in your brain to 24 months ago, what was dominating the headlines in terms of security? It was the Target breach and all of these other credit card breaches in retail. Those are really important. But as security professionals, we were asking ourselves, is there a more important issue? And that thought exercise led us to the concept of, well, the worst thing that you could possibly do in a cyber context would be kill somebody. We started the research that day. The obvious first place to start investigating was healthcare, and as we started our preliminary research, we realized we were onto something, and 24 months later, here we are. The hypothesis was that you could deploy a cyber attack that results in harm or fatality to a patient. That's exactly what we proved. Forbes was the first organization to publish the research. There have been several dozen other news stories about it. But ultimately we found not only is it possible, it's very easy in today's current environment. So let's talk about those findings. First and foremost, we found that the healthcare industry has a myopic, almost exclusive focus on patient data, not on patient health. And when you think about the purpose of healthcare, what is the purpose? To improve patient outcomes, do no harm. Well, if there's no effort to pursue that mission, how could you possibly accomplish that mission? We found several things that supported this finding. One was we identified a number of security vulnerabilities, which, if exploited, would result in harm or fatality to a patient. We then identified a number of business and industry shortcomings that lead to the introduction of these security vulnerabilities. For us, it wasn't enough to just identify problems. We needed to also articulate solutions. So we published what we refer to as a blueprint. This blueprint is a step-by-step guide that helps an organization of any size migrate from whatever its current point A is in its security plan to a more resilient point B. This blueprint, which I won't go into very much detail today, though I will touch the principal concepts that comprise it, while it was designed for healthcare, roughly 90 to 95% of this document is applicable to pretty much any industry. That's some of the things we're going to talk about today. So when we looked at the status quo of what the healthcare industry looks like, there was a multiplying factor where the industry was pursuing the wrong mission. They were seeking to protect patient data and not trying to protect patient health, multiplied by an outdated approach. The approach in healthcare is focused on defending against untargeted attacks performed in an unsophisticated manner. Well, that doesn't at all consider the modern adversary, which is in fact deploying very sophisticated attacks in a targeted manner. That ultimately leads to failure. This formula applies well beyond healthcare. Many industries that we work in, whether it's from our consulting practice or our research practice, have this same challenge. And I'll talk about how to unpack that. So let's compare the distinction between patient data and patient health. Patient data, of course, is the information about you. So it's your prescriptions, your allergies, your treatment history. An adversary who wants to compromise patient data is primarily motivated by profit. Now, different adversaries are all motivated, all for different reasons, and so there are different motivations, but the primary adversary motivation for compromising data is to be able to take that data and monetize it. When you think about a healthcare record, it's worth roughly 20 to 100 times what a credit card is worth on the black market. So that's going to draw a lot of adversaries who want to make more money with the similar type of attack techniques. But when you think about patient health, it's a different story. Someone would attack an individual patient's health, which is, of course, your actual physical well-being. Someone would attack that not to generate profit, but in order to instill fear or to harm. Those are very different motivations. They're going to attract different types of adversaries. And if all you're doing is protecting this one, any attack against that one is going to be highly probable to be successful. So I mentioned the distinction between untargeted and targeted attacks. A simple way to think about the distinction is that untargeted attacks are like a shotgun. A shotgun distributes damage to a broad spectrum, but it is not precise in its aim. By contrast, a targeted attack would be similar to a sniper rifle. A sniper rifle, you select an individual target, you zoom in on it, and you pull the trigger. Our research demonstrated that the healthcare industry doesn't have mechanisms to protect against this. The other important factor that I noted is the distinction between unsophisticated and sophisticated attacks. The definition is a little bit more nuanced than this, but at its most simple level, an unsophisticated attack is effectively one where an adversary in a single step compromises an asset. These are primarily automated scripts. Google is actually a pretty effective tool in the hacker's toolkit. You can literally Google and go find these automated scripts and go run them yourself without having to know how they actually work. So an unsophisticated attack would be an adversary who gets one of those tools, runs the tool. Anything that is victimized is the end of that attack. By contrast, a sophisticated attack requires an adversary to perform multiple stages. Attack one system, pivot to attack another system, and then so on until ultimately getting to the final victim. This is not necessarily to say that any of these steps are more difficult, just that an adversary must perform them in order to get to the end victim. This is how most organizations today are compromised. I mentioned Target a while back. That's exactly how Target was compromised. The healthcare industry doesn't have any mechanisms trying to deal with this right now. So if we were going to present this graphically, what this chart represents, across the rows, you have the different primary adversary types that we identified. You have two major columns. On the left, patient health. On the right, patient data. Within each of those major categories, you have two subcolumns focused on targeted or untargeted attacks. So, to summarize what I just described, the healthcare industry is focused on protecting patient data against unsophisticated, untargeted attacks. Everything else, however, does not have effective considerations in place, including the entire sphere of attacks against patient health. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that physicians don't care about patient health or that hospital administrators don't care about patient health. They absolutely do. But the business of healthcare, from a security context, is not set up to defend against those types of attacks today. So let's break down what some of those attack anatomies might look like and see how data plays a role in that. One of the first items that we looked at was attacks against patient monitor. To make a distinction, patient monitors are passive medical devices, which is to say that they are not actually doing anything to the patient. They are recording output from the patient. By contrast, an active medical device would be something like an insulin pump or a pacemaker. It's probably pretty obvious how if you could attack one of those and those things are distributing drugs or manipulating your heartbeat, how tampering with that device could have an impact on patient health. What's less obvious is how an attack against a passive medical device could have an impact on patient health. What we found with this particular patient monitor was that we could exploit a vulnerability known as authentication bypass. And then we could execute code remotely. So what that meant was that an adversary from a remote vantage point at any position in the world could actually access that monitor and manipulate the data that the monitor is ingesting. So by feeding it different types of data, the monitor will react in different ways. What you could do with that data manipulation is you could actually trigger alarms in certain ways. So one thing you could do is you could trigger false alarms. So let's take, for example, a patient who is somehow incapacitated. They are under anesthesia on the operating table, or they're in a coma, or they're intubated with a breathing tube in. And they can't speak up when the alarm starts saying that they're in cardiac arrest. You can't say, hey, I don't know why that's alarming you, I'm okay. The responding care would follow a protocol, which is to administer the electric paddles. So you now have actually just weaponized the staff. Because when you administer electric paddles to someone who doesn't need them, you're going to harm or potentially kill that patient. The other thing that this does, triggering false alarms, is that it draws care away from those who might need it. It also creates a diversion and disruption within the healthcare environment. We've probably all seen those gangster movies where one gangster is hurt and he's in the hospital and he has his guard standing out front, and his rival gangster needs to figure out a way to get that guard away from the door so he can go attack his rival. This is one way you would do that. The opposite is also true, where you could manipulate the data to actually disable authentic alarms. So now the patient who is actually in duress and does need that responding care, does need those electric paddles, would not get the care that they need. So that attack I just described is one that can be performed remotely from anywhere in the world. And we had several examples of remote attacks. It's important to note, too, the premise of local attacks, because there's some significant implications there as well. So one of the other devices that we looked at was a lobby check-in kiosk. For any of you who may have been to the hospital recently, you notice there's these kiosks where rather than checking in with the staff to say you're here for your appointment, you can actually check in at a kiosk. Keep in mind these kiosks are in the lobby. Technically, this is private property because the hospital owns it, but for all intents and purposes, this is public property. It's accessible to any person who wants to come and insert data into this kiosk. What we found is that an adversary could actually take the kiosk out of kiosk mode and gain full administrative control over it. Then we found that this kiosk is on the same subnet as other critical life-saving and life-sustaining equipment. And what we found is that we could pivot to take over the blood work equipment. Now we could manipulate or at least observe the data that's being processed through the blood work equipment. So one thing that we could do there is we could identify a specific individual, who that person is, what they're getting treated for, in what room. And if you did it again, you now had information on 2 patients, and you could actually manipulate the data to transpose their treatments. So now you'd arrive at a situation where patient A is supposed to be treated for something, but they're actually being treated for something that is an affliction of patient B. Both those patients, that is an adverse outcome. So I mentioned before that in addition to some of the security vulnerabilities, there are some really common business issues that we identified. There are a lot, several dozen we found, but they range everything from insufficient funding, insufficient staffing, insufficient training. Just talked about how there was improper network segmentation, lack of audit, lack of monitoring, inappropriate corporate hierarchy. One of the other really interesting things was that we found a wide instance of software that had been custom built by the hospital itself or by third-party vendors that had never gone through any sort of security assessment. Now, take it with a grain of salt from the guy whose business is performing security assessments, but I think we can all agree that deploying a system that has implication on patient health should probably not be deployed without considering how it can be attacked. In addition to those many design issues, we identified several implementation issues, including things like shared credentials, people using the same passwords. Default credentials was widely used, where a system that comes out of the box with whatever its admin password is and admin username was never changed. That's effectively publicly available information. And that is where adversaries look to exploit pretty quickly. So that's a pretty harrowing tale of organizations across an entire industry who have a wide range of security flaws. So what should organizations do about it? So within our blueprint, we talked about principles of secure design that organizations can think about in order to better think about security in a data context. So first and foremost, organizations really need to get back to the basics. These principles of secure design, which I'm going to talk about, this is not revolutionary concepts. These are time-tested, time-honored, well-developed philosophies about how systems can be built in a way that's resilient against attack. Yet what commonly happens from a business perspective is there's excitement about something, some new innovation, some new type of technology, whether it's cloud, BYOD, connected devices, whatever it is. And these basic fundamentals are effectively thrown out the window. This would be like a baseball team wanting to win the World Series and saying, well, this year all we're going to do is try to hit grand slams every time. But we're not going to spend a minute working on infield grounders. I'm a Red Sox fan, and Billy Buckner to this day still bothers us because infield grounders meant that we didn't win the World Series when a ground ball went right between his legs. Does anybody know what a threat model is? A threat model is a process through which an organization understands the things that might be appealing for an adversary to attack, and then thinks about how the organization will be attacked in order to defend. So today we talked a lot about healthcare. Your business may not be in healthcare, but that's where threat modeling comes in, because your unique threat model will be different, even from other organizations in your same field. My man, the Cheshire Cat, has a great quote when it comes to threat modeling when he says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So if you repackage that in security parlance, what he's saying is, if you don't know what you're defending, and you don't know who you're defending against, how can you possibly be successful? If you don't know you're defending, you don't know who you're defending against, how can you possibly be successful? If there's one takeaway that you have after our session today, it's go back to your organization and start thinking through threat modeling. It's fairly straightforward. Threat modeling has three primary components. You identify your assets. So we're here at a conference talking about data. But what does that really mean in your organization? And are all data assets of equal value? And is the data itself actually the asset that you care about? Or is it an extension of that asset? We talked about how you can manipulate data to impact health. Then you want to think about adversaries. Identifying who the adversaries are, what are their characteristics, what type of access do they have to time, money, computational resources, and most importantly, what is their motivation? Because a nation state will attack you for different reasons than organized crime will attack you. And then ultimately you talk about your architecture, which is your collection of attack surfaces against which your adversaries will launch campaigns in pursuit of your assets. Once you go through the process of threat modeling, you want to make sure you build out a roadmap. This image is pulled directly out of the blueprint that we published and is free for all of you to consume. I'd be happy to send you the link if you're interested. But it delineates a very clear process through which an organization can go step by step in order to arrive at the ultimate state, which is readiness. Readiness is where you're considering, in the event of a breach, now what do I do? What's my incident response plan? Most companies think that they're in this stage, but haven't done the necessary steps in order to prepare for that stage first. So build out that roadmap, even if it understands that it might take you 2 years to get to readiness. It doesn't matter how long it's going to take your organization. Build the plan and get started on it. Is anybody in here actually from San Diego? Okay, there's a very San Diego problem here, and I'm sure it's consistent in other cities as well, but where people modify their mufflers to where the cars are so loud that it actually sets off car alarms as it drives by. Has anyone ever experienced that? It's pretty annoying, right? Wakes you up at night. That's what's known as an aftermarket modification. So the car is built in a certain way, someone comes in, makes a change to it that gives the appearance of improved performance, but actually doesn't make any meaningful change to the underlying performance of the engine. It's the same with security. You need to build security in throughout the build process in order for it to be effective, and just trying to address security at the end is the same as modifying your muffler. Not going to give you any more horsepower. In a quantifiable sense, building security in also reduces pain. One of the difficult aspects of security is that first you have to find issues, then once you find issues, you have to deal with them. The problem is, the later in the process that you identify a problem, the more effort it takes to fix that problem. So what this graph represents is a requirements or design level bug. The later it's identified, the more work you have to put in to fix it. There's a great example coming out of the hotel business, where there are a wide number of electronic locking systems that have been deployed all over the world to the tune of millions of units. And there are some questions about security vulnerabilities that might exist in those locking systems. But it would be cost prohibitive to replace all of those if there were issues, because they're here. The pain is too great to deal with it. So thinking about security early on helps you avoid pain later. Reduced asset handling. Many chief marketing officer will say, collect all the data we can. We'll do some big data analytics. We'll figure out ways to sell new services. We'll monetize it in some way. Well, the more data you collect as an organization, the juicier you are as a member of the herd. Adversaries want to go where the richest attack targets are. So what the concept of reduced asset handling suggests is capture the data that you need and forget everything else. Even if there might be a future business case for it, wait till you have the business case until you start trying to do something with that data, because it will reduce the likelihood that you'll be targeted in an attack. Complete mediation. Say what you will about the sham that is airport security, but one thing that you can be guaranteed is that every time you fly commercial in the United States, without exception, you'll go through security. Should be the same with all organizations. Every attempt to provide access to your valuable assets needs to be verified for authentication and authorization. This is a common issue we see across all organizations, where the trust model is inherently broken and they don't actually verify every time whether someone who's trying to access something should have access to that thing. Assessment matters. Make no doubt about this one thing. Whether or not your organization proactively tries to find and resolve your own security flaws, the bad guys are going to do so. Your adversaries are absolutely going to investigate your systems for flaws, whether you do it or not. One thing that we saw in our research, and we see across other pieces of research and our consulting practice as well, is that organizations don't think enough about the role that security assessment plays in the process. Now, as you go through the process of thinking about security assessment, it's important to understand methodology. Many organizations like to think about things like penetration testing, code scanning as appropriate approaches. Those adopt what's known as a black box perspective, which is to say, in that evaluation process, the assessing entity has no knowledge about how the system works. Emulate the bad guy. The bad guy doesn't know how the system works, right? Not exactly. The problem with a black box approach is it would be similar to going to your doctor because something ails you, and he says, tell me your symptoms, and you say, you're the expert, you figure it out. You would never do that with your doctor. You shouldn't do that with protecting your own system. So be cognizant of that approach. Be careful of checkbox security. There's a natural inclination to want to comply with regulations, to find a list of practices and to just check them off as you pursue them. But think about what a checklist ultimately is. Standards must be uniform so that they can be applicable to a wide range of organizations. Yet every organization is unique. So by definition, even a compliant organization will have gaps in its security approach. So be cautious of checkbox security. And be cautious of trust without verify. Every company in this room is using some sort of a third party for something. That third party is probably making claims to you about the security of its solution. You need to think about, am I verifying these claims? Or am I making business critical decisions based purely on what a salesman has been telling me? So be cautious of trust without verify. Things that are effective that you should be thinking about are things like white box. It's the opposite of the black box where we talked about before, where you keep the doctor out. The idea here is if you want to find vulnerabilities, you need to have someone help you actually see the way your organization sets things up. And then ultimately, don't be reliant on scanning. We talked before about unsophisticated versus sophisticated attacks. Scanning really is only effective at identifying those unsophisticated attacks. You need to perform manual assessment in order to find those sophisticated attacks. Security is an ongoing process. Be cognizant and careful to not fall into the trap that we did security 2 years ago, we're secure. As you continue to evolve and iterate, as the market continues to change, as the collection of adversaries adapt their techniques, your attack landscape will evolve. Understand SteppingStone attacks. So I gave the example before about how you could attack a passive medical device, and that would enable you to manipulate care, in this case, a surgical procedure. Target was another example of where the ultimate victim is not the first point of attack. Adversaries know that most organizations are integrating third parties, and that oftentimes those third parties, at least some of them, are small startup companies who have not necessarily thought of security yet. That's where the adversaries go first. That's not the ultimate victim. They'll use that startup's trusted access to get to the ultimate end victim. Assume hostility, or put another way, be reluctant to trust. So as you are thinking about who has access to your data, even your own people, even the people you personally interviewed and hired, you need to assume that they may be witting or unwitting adversaries. So really think about, when it comes to access and privilege, how you hand it out. You want to build layers of defense in depth. Defense in depth is effectively a paradigm that says, identify your most valuable assets and build layers of security emanating outwards from there. What you're doing here is you're assuming a breach will happen, and you're mitigating the damage that an adversary will be able to accomplish. Segmentation, you want to make sure you're separating both networks themselves as well as access rights, user privileges. Because at some point, some aspect of your organization will be compromised. It could be an individual who was once a trusted employee, now becomes disgruntled, say with a political statement that the CEO of your company made, and now says, I'm going to harm this company. Well, if all employees have access to all things, all of your data, that's going to be a very dangerous scenario. Conversely, it could be the scenario of where one of your trusted partners, a third-party integration, is compromised, same thing. Configuration ultimately matters. How you build your systems, how you articulate and outline access controls is a significant aspect to how you're going to defend ultimately against attack. Trust but verify. We talked before about be cautious to not just trust and make decisions solely on the claims of a salesperson. Probably my favorite marketing claim that is used widely today is things like bank level security or military grade encryption. Those are ludicrous claims. What they're talking about is the actual encryption itself. but it's insignificant to the security posture of an actual organization. It's like saying, well, you have a really cheap Hyundai. That Hyundai is a luxury car because it uses the same tire pressure as a Rolls-Royce does. Okay, maybe both of those vehicles do have that same feature, but that does not actually support the claim you're trying to make by saying luxury grade. Training. You'll hear it from me. You'll hear it anytime you talk to a security professional. The people element is often the weakest link in an organization. And often that's because the average user doesn't actually know what they should or shouldn't be doing. Usually they're not willfully harming an organization, though there is that type of user. But often it's because they don't know any better. So training is critically important from the executive level all the way down to the average end user. Separate security from functionality. This boils down to priority. When you think about the role that security has, security cares about things like protecting assets, making sure that access controls are effective. Functionality cares about things like performance, user experience. Those don't really overlap. Yet most companies actually merge these into the same group. What winds up happening when you have conflicting priorities within the same group is that priorities such as security priorities get pushed to the bottom, and thus an organization is not going to be able to effectively pursue its security mission. By extension, that means that organizations should have a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, and they should empower that CISO. Many companies are structured in a way, and we saw this 100% of the hospitals that we looked at. Many organizations are structured in a way where the CISO does not report to the CEO. So in effect, the CISO is actually not a C-level executive. The CISO typically reports to the CIO or the CTO. The CISO should be reporting all the way into that top level of executive management because that is the most effective way to pursue your security mission. So ultimately, to summarize everything we just talked about, think like an adversary. It will help give you perspective on your own data and how someone might attack it, manipulate it, compromise it. Understand and adhere to principles of secure design. These aren't my opinion. These have been around for decades, and they're effective. And then ultimately, you want to think about security assessments before the bad guys do, because they will. That wraps up for me. Are there any questions that I can answer? Go ahead.
First drafts.
Absolutely. So there's probably two areas of the presentation that are really relevant to your question. For those of you who may not have heard the question he's asking about, is data loss prevention an important mechanism in a company's security posture? So data loss prevention falls under the category of defense in depth. So it is one of a series of mechanisms that help to mitigate the effectiveness of the ultimate breach. The other area that is significant to note is that DLP is part of the process that would be the outcome of your threat modeling exercise. So I can't tell you right now whether you should or should not use DLP or which one you should use or how to implement it. But once you go through that process of thinking through, well, what are we trying to protect and why? That will help you understand what's the right solution for your organization. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yes, so some of these tools that are already deployed in the marketplace or are in future development stages, they are going to help accomplish certain problems. One of the things you want to be careful of is that because there is such a need for security right now, that creates demand, which leads to a lot of companies selling products that you may or may not need. We see it quite often where a company hasn't necessarily thought through what is the internal threat. You mentioned that you guys have spent a lot of time thinking about the external threat. Now you're starting to think about the internal threat. DLP is part of that. Most companies think of the internal threat as a single type of adversary. It's actually several different types of adversaries, each of whom attack for different reasons, and each of whom must be defended against differently. So as you go through that process, and that is a subset of threat modeling, And as you identify those adversaries, that helps you think through, is this product going to help our particular need? Sure, so to restate, the question is, what do you do about cloud solutions? Okay. So cloud is really interesting in certain ways. What cloud effectively has done is helped an organization provide a solution without needing to own the hardware. In every other way, cloud solutions aren't really that different. So if you think about cloud in the context of how would I build this system if I owned the hardware? You apply those same lines of thinking to a cloud solution and you'll be in good shape. So one of the areas that organizations often stumble when it comes to cloud solutions is they think, well, I use Amazon Web Services. Look at this security page of AWS. Look at all these amazing things that they do from a security perspective. I'm a startup. How could I possibly, replicate all of that? So I'm going to use AWS and I'm nice and secure. Well, what AWS has done is effectively given you a very strong data center. But they haven't done anything about how you build the application. So organizations who are leveraging cloud solutions, all of these principles that we talked about today are relevant. Thinking about how are you going to provision users? How are you going to separate privileges? How are you going to mitigate damage in the event of a compromise? So making sure to think through that is the most critical aspect. And so the way that we help most cloud companies is we're in the fortunate position where now we actually have good relationships with some of the cloud providers themselves to where we can have that viewpoint all the way through to the data center, which is the cloud. But even before we had obtained those relationships, understanding in a threat context, how is this thing built on top of that cloud solution, that helps them become resilient. Yes, so to restate, the question is about whether these are applicable or have an impact on data quality, correct? We often refer to it as the holy trinity of security. It has three pieces to it: confidentiality of data, availability of data, and integrity of data. And the integrity piece is what you're talking about. So some adversaries will attack without any need or intention of actually stealing the data. They just want to make it useless for you because that accomplishes whatever their mission might be. So absolutely, yes, to answer your question. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I'll be around afterwards if you want to talk one-on-one. Thank you.